This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
So I'd like to welcome you all and to thank you for coming. Gilad was actually the one who came up with the idea for a live recording of this episode, what will become an episode of both our podcasts. We met online. This is how people meet now. And today, this morning, for the first time, met in person. You're all familiar from the invitations with the bios. Amir Tibon is the Washington correspondent. Do you call it bureau chief or correspondent? Washington correspondent of Haaretz.
Bureau is basically my briefcase. So, so technically, my wife is the bureau chief. And,
and your wife is here tonight.
Yes.
And Saeed Arikat is the Washington correspondent of Al-Quds, the Palestinian daily, and he's been doing this forever. Yeah. I first met you in 1990, and you were already, So when did you start?
I started a very long time ago. Of course, I had a couple of breaks. I tried to go out to make some money, but I failed at that. So, and then I worked for the UN for a while.
Right.
So,
Also, on my part, thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you for Ori and APN and J Street for sponsoring this event. And also thanks to the panelists. As you may have heard already, I'm Gilad Halpern. I'm co-host of the Tel Aviv-based podcast, the Tel Aviv Review, which is an English language podcast that's dedicated to Israel and books and ideas and everything in between. And I'm very grateful to Ori for having taken up this opportunity and arranged the event tonight. And on this note, I'd like to ask our panelists the first question, which is, what are really the main focuses of your work as Washington correspondents? What do you think are the top issues that are of interest to your readership?
Let me
Go first. I'll
okay. Well, I'm working for a Palestinian newspaper, the only real Palestinian newspaper that has been around for a very long time. I focus on the Palestinian-Israeli issue, on U.S. policy towards the Palestinians, U.S. policy towards Israel, things that are related to that. Much like this week, there's been a lot of news because of Representative Ilhan Omar and the anti-Semitism charges and so on. So we had, I wrote basically every day I had something to write about it, but also the region. I mean, in the past, and the lead up to the Iraq War, for instance, I focused on Iraq. During the Arab Spring, we focus on the Arab Spring. I'm a State Department correspondent, so I go there daily. I still do, but we don't have daily press briefings anymore. So we focus. My priorities are, the Palestinian-Israeli issue, then the region, and then the world and national security issues as well.
So actually, my answer is quite similar to Saeed's answer. For Haaretz, I would say there are three main issues that they expect me to write about. Number one is the U.S.-Israel relationship, which is very broad. It's the White House and the State Department and the Pentagon, but also members of Congress and public opinion polling on this question. This is a kind of a broad headline, but the U.S.-Israel relationship is just one. The second issue, like Saeed said, is broader American foreign policy in the Middle East, in the region. What the United States does towards, or with Egypt and Syria and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Turkey and on, it has an impact on Israel and also on the Palestinians. So I understand why for the readers of Haaretz and of Al-Quds, they care about these issues. And the third one for us, for Haaretz, is the American Jewish community. Because the U.S. has the largest Jewish diaspora, the largest concentration of Jewish people outside of Israel, obviously that's also a priority. I would add one more category that is not a permanent category, but I've had to deal with it for the last 2 years. I call it Trump madness stories.
That's true.
When there is a really extraordinary issue that involves the madness of the Trump administration, sometimes the paper would want me to explain it to our readers. It's not all the time. For a lot of the daily shenanigans, they can just take the wires, the AP or Reuters, and that will be enough. But for example, when the Anthony Scaramucci drama was going on, The paper really asked me to explain, to simplify this to readers because it was such a good story. So that's not a permanent category, but sometimes it also comes on the radar, Trump madness
Yeah,
stories.
WTF stories.
Exactly, exactly.
But you were a diplomatic correspondent before coming here. How is your work reporting from here different from what it was as a diplomatic correspondent back in Israel?
There are actually more similarities than differences. At the end of the day, I think this is true for me and also what Said said about his work, that the number one focus are the diplomatic national security issues. And if you cover it from Jerusalem or from Washington, okay, there are differences. Washington is bigger and the Congress is huge compared to the Knesset. And the priorities of the Israeli-Palestinian issue are different here than they are back home, but the job is the same. You talk to officials in the government, you talk to people in the parliament, Congress, or the Knesset, you talk to people in what I call the second and third circles, former government officials, people in think tanks, academics, political advisors, people from different opposition groups. And you try to, diplomats, of course, from foreign countries, and you try to stitch a story. It's the same job wherever you do it.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your audiences. And here I think we'll find some differences between the two of you. Amir, when I was in Washington reporting for Haaretz back a long time ago in the early 90s, I knew exactly what my audience was because there was only a Hebrew edition and it was only in paper. So it was the 60,000 or whatever was the number of subscribers who got the newspaper in the morning. That has completely changed. What's it like now?
So I would say that for Haaretz, of course, there are two differences from what you described. One is the internet, which means that, of course, Haaretz, most people who read our stories online or in print are subscribers, but they're not the only people. And once you put a link to your story on Twitter or on Facebook, there is no limit to how many people can see it and who are those people. And whether it's in Hebrew or in English, the rules are the same. Once you put up a story and there is a link, so for example, in Haaretz, in order to read all of the regular coverage, you need a subscription. But there is a certain limit of free stories you can see just by clicking on them from Facebook and Twitter. So a person who is not used up their ability, I don't know what the number is, and don't quote me on this, but a person who has not used their quota, they can just click on the story, and it can be someone who, in Israel, their daily newspaper subscription is actually to Yediot Aharonot or one of the right-wing newspapers. And outside of Israel, it can be someone in Saudi Arabia, in any place of the United States, and or it could be, a Palestinian from Nablus. I mean, the idea is that once the link is out there, this is your audience. So you don't write only for the subscribers. Of course, you also want to do a good job for them. You want to keep them, receive the stories that they're interested in and that they care about, but the audience potential is wider.
Mm-hmm. How would you say it?
Well, pretty much the same. I mean, it used to be only the print edition, and it is still published only in Arabic. I tried at various times to get an English paper or an English website even, and we did not succeed simply because of the money. We're a very poor newspaper, and it's completely dependent on advertising and things like this. And it's subject to Israeli publication laws because it publishes in Jerusalem, in print in Jerusalem. We print 80,000 copies a day. It goes to Jordan, and so on. So my audience are the Palestinians. I write on daily basis, and by the way, I mean, like you on Trump, they can't have enough of it. I mean, I'm telling you, there is a Trump story every single day. It's an amazing thing. There's always Trump and his group and so on. So, people are reading it and so on. And we online, it gets a great deal of readership, not only in Jordan, but also throughout the Arab world. So this is our readership. And we also we tried a couple of times to do a video version, and it just did not get anywhere. Yeah.
But still, you have, I'm assuming you know pretty much where your audience is concentrated.
Yes.
And so your readers in the Arabic edition, for me, it's more complicated because you write for a bilingual audience or two different linguistic audiences. But do you know whether you have, I'm assuming that most of your readers are in Palestine, but what about worldwide? What about the Palestinian American community? Do Do they read and do they interact with your writing?
Yes, the Palestinian American community, they read my newspapers because it's posted everywhere, and it is really, in all honesty, there are no Palestinian news outlets. There are Arab outlets, like you have Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, you have other newspapers and so on. We're the only Palestinian media entity in town, or even in America. There are local papers, in Dearborn, Michigan, or in San Francisco. You find these things that have advertising for butcher shops and liquor shops that are owned by Palestinians and so on. So, but they call me. I get a lot of emails, and sometimes I get horrible emails. And if I say something, how could you say this? I mean, this is, and try to explain to them. I report the news. I'm not. I don't do commentary. I used to do a weekly commentary. I don't do that anymore. So basically, I only report the news, and that's my.
But that's a new thing for you because with the internet now, they are able to read you. So do you ever adjust your writing or your reporting to a broader audience than before?
Adjust. I mean, I write my story. I mean, I get it and I send it. I don't adjust it. I don't really think about how people will react on Twitter or on Facebook or something like that. I try to write and publish as objectively as I can, and to their credit, my publishers and my editors and so on, they publish all my stories. I mean, in my long years, I think maybe 3 or 4 stories were not published. So I focus on the news, the raw news, and I try to make it palatable and to explain it to my audience who are they have a different culture. The terms of reference are so much different and so on. So I try to, because I have to do, for instance, elections. I cover the elections, and we cover it diligently. I mean, I've been going to the conventions and so on. And you have to explain to people all these things because it's so different. So you can't just adjust whatever you want to say so you can please or fit somebody else's paradigm.
I mean, as I said, for you, it's more complicated. I mean, take one of your beats, the Jewish American community. When you write for the Hebrew edition of Haaretz and for the English edition that is read predominantly by Jewish Americans, the reporting has to be very different. Do you take that into account when you write, or do you just file one copy and let the newspaper deal with it?
So I write all of my stories. If you see a story by me in English, I wrote it. If you see a story in Hebrew, I wrote it. I don't let them the newspaper do a translation. I prefer it that way. I want my words to be owned by myself, not by translator in either language. And it's true that sometimes you can report on the same story. And if you read the Hebrew and the English, there will be some differences. It's true. The differences will mainly be issues of, for example, length of the article. A lot of times when it comes to issues of the American Jewish community, something that can be spread over 3 stories in the English edition will appear as only 1 story in the Hebrew edition, which will be a bit longer. Why? Because the pace of events and developments that are very interesting for American Jews are not necessarily as interesting for the Israeli reader, who at the end of the day wants to have more of a digest. Even on the Ilhan Omar story that we had on the week that we're doing this recording, I think I wrote 4 or 5 stories in English and probably 2 stories in Hebrew. Because in English, every separate development was worthy of a story for the readers here in the United States, for whom this is the biggest story right now and people are fixated about it. Whereas for the readers in Israel, the daily developments, the back and forth between the Democrats in the House and the Republicans, and this member said this and this member said that, not all of it is worth of a story. You can basically approach it at the end of the day when you have a broader picture and say, this is what happened today on this interesting story that is controversial right now in Congress that involves a Muslim member of Congress and claims of anti-Semitism and AIPAC. And you can make more of a digest story out of it, especially because right now in Israel there's an election going on and the priorities of the newspaper are not fixated on here on Washington. So that's one of the differences. What is very important for me is that there will not be differences in what I call the tone of the story. And you can have, in this story can be 500 words and this one can be 1,000 words, but you want to, at the end of the day, have the same essence of the story in both languages, because when you start making differences between those things, that becomes unfair to the readers. You can't have one story that says X and another story that says Y. That doesn't fly. I mean, especially today in the world of the internet where everything is so accessible and available, you'll become a joke if you do that. Even if there are technical differences, you want to have the same tone and essence to the story.
We talked a little bit about your readers' fascination with the Trump administration, with Trump. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your relationship with the Trump administration. In other words, the extent to which they have an interest in developing relations with the Israeli media, with the Israeli press, with the Palestinian, or more generally, the Arab press. Do they reach out to you? Do you have easy access to them? How does it work?
In my case, I have no access whatsoever now. Really? It used to be that I did have access. I go to the State Department. With this administration, we are completely shut out. I can barely squeeze in a question. I do, whenever there's a briefing, I manage to ask about the Palestinian issue. I mean, I used to ask about everything, but now I'm so constricted. So, for instance, today, because it's the International Women's Day, I asked about the Damon prison, and there are 48 Palestinian women. Many of them, they were girls and have grown up to be women in prison and so on. Many of them on administrative detention that is renewed and so on. So, I managed to do this, but other than that, it's almost nothing. I mean, I send them emails, they don't respond to me. In the former administration, we had access. The best access I ever had during the George W. Bush administration, ironically, because I used to go to the White House, we used to get questions. Powell, he used to do this takeout almost every day. So we would talk to him on a daily basis. Condoleezza Rice was a little bit, accessible, but not very much. This administration is completely, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, we're completely shut out.
It's interesting and maybe counterintuitive because it seems like the Trump administration has been trying to reach out to Palestinians above the heads of their leaders.
Interesting that you actually say that. And there is something very particular to my newspaper with this issue. But they talked to Walid Abu Zulf, the owner of the newspaper. And in fact, I think he came, one time and met with Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and so on. And both have published lengthy articles. I mean, definitely Greenblatt published 3, maybe even more articles in my newspaper. So there is.
Jared gave you guys the first interview.
Yes.
I was getting angry phone calls from my editors. Right. They said, why is Kushner talking to Quds and not to Haaretz?
Yeah, he called Walid Abu Zulf, the owner. They live in London, so he came and interviewed him and so on. It was really a very tame kind of interview. I would ask tougher questions and so on, but that was their condition. In that respect, I think they are in touch because sometimes he tells me, listen, I spoke with Jason Greenblatt, but I tried, Eddie Vasquez. Eddie Vasquez worked for Jason Greenblatt, and he was in the State Department, and we knew him and we were buddies, and I asked him a number of times, come on, arrange for an interview for him. He said, I'll look into it, I'll float the idea and so on. So you're right in that respect.
What's your experience?
So I think that I would separate different branches of the Trump administration. And again, this is a personal experience. It's not, doesn't necessarily represent their whole approach to media or even Israeli media. I think what is happening in the National Security Council is really possible to understand, dysfunctional from my point of view. First of all, this administration has had 3 national security advisors in 2 years, and each time when there is a different national security advisor, staff changes and people leave, and it's hard. Sometimes you don't know who is still there, honestly. Mm-hmm. And I don't find them to be very responsive or very coherent, and actually it is hard to communicate with them. The little team in the White House that works on the Israeli, Palestinian, and Middle East peace plan, I don't know how to call it, I find them to be much better. They are responsive and they do work with the Israeli media and they do arrange sometimes briefings. I don't think Kushner has given any interviews in the Israeli media, but Greenblatt has, and he, just like he published articles in Al-Quds, he's published articles in Haaretz. So there is communication with that small team that is basically, it's like Jared Kushner has his own media show. and they are responsive and you can work with them and sometimes they will answer your questions. They don't give you a lot of information because they are not leaking anything about their plan right now, and that's what you want to know at the end of the day. But you can get information about technical issues like where they are going in the region, who they are meeting, when it's going to be. That's the level. In the State Department, I think the experience is much like what I said about the National Security Council. Secretaries change, spokespeople change. We had Heather Nauert, then she was supposed to go to the UN and then she wasn't. Now there's some kind of a vacancy. It's not really clear. The briefings used to be every day in past administrations. Now it's maybe once, twice a week.
4 briefings since the beginning of the year.
So that says everything, I think. And that is a limited level. I would give a higher grade to the Jared Kushner shop and very bad grades to the others on this issue of accessibility and working with the media. And by the way, I think when people talk about Trump's popularity in the United States, about his international standing in other countries, yes, a lot of it has to do with policy and a lot of it has to do with him, but also just bad functioning of your media shop can really hurt you as a politician. It doesn't matter if you're the president of the United States or the last member of the Knesset. If you don't work in a smart and effective way with the media, you will be in trouble.
Regardless of what it means for Trump and his administration, do you feel that it seriously undermines your work as journalists, or do you find alternatives to getting that information that you don't get in the normal way?
Well, in my case, I find it's more difficult. I mean, we always have other sources and so on. I mean, I've been around for a very long time. You can't help but actually establish some contacts, and you get little drippings from time to time. But without a doubt, this administration makes it very difficult for me to do my job. I'm a much older guy than most journalists in town and so on. So I get a little bit sometimes discouraged, and I get tired. I used to go around the think tank quite often, attend in this building, in the building next door, all around Winnip, wherever. So you have sources. There's plenty of news on the Palestinian-Israeli issue. So you just have to tap into it. But definitely it's becoming more difficult, and especially with the Arab Spring, because it took the steam out of the Palestinian-Israeli issue and put the focus elsewhere. And you have all these Arab news outlets, but none of them are focused on the Palestinian issue. They are more interested in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, like Al Jazeera Al Arabiya, Sky News Arabia, whatever. So it is becoming more difficult for me.
What about you, Emil?
I wouldn't say it undermines or hurts my work. Sometimes it becomes more challenging. But I think one of the challenges, for example, is that with this administration, when someone in a position of responsibility says something, a lot of times that doesn't mean anything. You could see it around some of the biggest events that have to do with Middle East policy. For example, the embassy move. In December of 2017, after Trump announced that he was going to move the embassy, you had Rex Tillerson and other, you remember Rex Tillerson?
Yes.
Other prominent people who came out and said, this will take years to do, nothing's going to happen so fast. And then all of a sudden, it just happened. Around the Syria withdrawal, we've seen the same phenomenon. Can anyone actually say what's the policy and when it's going to be implemented and how? You've had really contradicting statements from Trump and Bolton and Mattis when he was still in government. And it's just Pompeo, it's impossible to make sense of it. By the way, on Jerusalem also, Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and the State Department, they've been saying that Trump's decision on Jerusalem doesn't mean that there was not going to be negotiations on the final boundaries of the city. But Trump himself says, I took it off the table.
Exactly.
So who do you believe? And I think this is the main challenge. And I wouldn't say it undermines my work. Maybe it even makes my work more fun because you report on all these contradicting statements. But to actually understand what's the policy and where it's going, yeah, that's difficult with this administration.
Are there professional relationships between Israeli and Arab journalists here in town? Do you use the other side, if you will, as sources? I'm asking because I remember I did a lot. But I wonder how it works today.
There were different times. I mean, I got together with Amir couple of times and so on. That's about it. There is, look, regarding the Palestinian-Israeli issue, as I repeated this evening a number of times, the Arab press is just not as focused on this issue as it was. So that makes, maybe in the old days, everybody was writing about the Palestinian issue and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Not anymore. So, it's really, I'm a one-man show in this town. The first thing I do, by the way, is I read Haaretz. And I think most Palestinians do. Definitely my family, my brothers and so on. And I always say, did you see this article on Haaretz and so on? So, but in terms of personal, on the professional level, no.
My experience is that you do have relationships, but it's not... at the end of the day, each journalist has his or her own stories and focuses. With Said, we've helped each other a number of times on meeting or texting or talking, what's with this, what's with that. And I have those kinds of friendly relationships with a number of, several other Arab reporters from other countries. One thing that is interesting is that when I, as an Israeli journalist, reach out to a colleague from an Arab newspaper, news website, TV station, I've never run into hostility. I've never run into refusal to talk. Everybody wants to be friends, everybody wants to work together, but nobody, for example, would give me an interview. Okay, it's very easy for me to call Peter Baker from the New York Times or someone from the Washington Post or from CNN and say, I'm a journalist from Arts and I want to interview you for an article about whatever. But if I called a Lebanese or Egyptian or Iraqi colleague, they would say, listen, Amir, I would love to get coffee or get a beer and talk about this, but I can't give an interview to your newspaper. That is one.
Oh, I'll give you an interview.
We solved it. We solved it. Yeah. So that's one thing you still do see, that even though there is changes in the approach, publicly, it's still an issue.
Said, I want to ask you, going back to what you just said, you've been in this country a very long time.
Very long time.
Yes, and you've worked as a journalist for a long time, for several decades.
I have.
How do you feel that, being a Palestinian American in this country has changed over the years? What was it like in the 80s when, the PLO were just, a terrorist organization or perceived as a terrorist organization on pickup trucks and, through the Oslo years until today?
Well, it was a very interesting time. You're right. Things have changed. They have morphed tremendously. There was a time when the PLO was considered a terrorist organization. Still is on the books. It's being considered as such. But there was an opening. There was a time when Arafat was coming and going to the White House, and there was a lot of coverage and so on. And remember, and our newspaper was subject to the military governor, the Hakim al-Askari, So we would publish a lot of times blank spaces, if you remember. Yep. It was always blank spaces. And then they
with the word "na'tadr," right?
Yeah, they would knock it out and so on. So it was difficult to write because they would say, no, this cannot be published. And then they said, look, this is embarrassing us, these blank spaces. You got to put something in it. So they would put anything. They would be advertising, stories, poetry, all kinds of things, just to fill the space. So there was a time when actually reporting was easier, during the after Oslo, although, I personally, I was opposed to Oslo, but, it made things easier. And then, as in the second Intifada, the hostility towards, because the conflict was quite violent and quite heated and so on. So this is also gets reflected here and so on. That's one. And on the other side, there was also a great deal of interest, not necessarily in, let's say, in the channels of government and so on, but definitely in think tanks. And you had, in fact, like events, Brookings, especially under the tenure of Martin Indyk for a while, and so on, that you had events, Howard would be there, and, when it would have things. So there was always, an interest in the issue that made things a little bit easier. But definitely we've seen it, go from almost restricted and looked upon in a very negative way and so on to looking at the journalists a bit more credibly and allowing them the space to work through, now. And then you had this love fest that was short between the PA and the Trump administration, And in fact, Abbas would come and say, yeah, I think this guy is really serious. He wants to do the deal of the century, and he wants to do all this and so on. But, that's the nature of the beast,
We're going to do one more round of questions here on the podium, and then we'd love to take questions from the audience. So start thinking up questions, and we'll have a roving mic that will go around. An issue that I wanted to explore with you, because I'm so fascinated by it and by how it impacts journalism, is social media. And it's an open question. I'm eager to learn how, for example, Twitter, with its immediacy and with the viral impact that it has, how it impacts your reporting.
Well, it's a great facility in terms that it has links to stories that are breaking. You're always on top of all the issues, so you have material to write about or to dig into, albeit superficial sometimes. But it has a link, it has this and so on. So definitely Twitter. I mean, today, for instance, I was in the briefing and I saw the story about the embassy in Saudi Arabia, the staff saying, look, Kushner shut us out completely from the last meeting. So you saw this immediately, you ask about it, you write about it tomorrow and so on. So in that respect, there is that aspect of it. On the other hand, of course, social media is, Twitter in particular, it does not lend itself to well thought out discussion and so on. So you lose at that end.
So sometimes people ask me, are you concerned as a journalist because of Trump and Netanyahu attacking the media? And I always say that from my personal point of view, the biggest threat to journalism is not Trump or Netanyahu. I'm talking about journalism in America and in Israel. It's Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. Because these websites are taking all of the money from advertising, drying up the newspapers and the news websites, and they are making the crowd, people who use them, accustomed to thin and low nutritious kind of news and information, and presenting more sophisticated and complicated and nuanced realities is just creates less traffic and interest. And I've been using Twitter as a journalist for 5 years now. And it's something you just learn. It's very sad. You can tweet out a link to a story, just write the headline. And remember, headlines are chosen by editors who already are trying to create interest and to generate clicks, people who will click the story. So if you just tweet out your headline, a lot of times, the number of clicks you will get is minimal. But if you add a personal opinion to it and make it a bit vicious and a bit nasty, you will get 10 times more people to actually click on your link. That's a sad reality. And so I think that these platforms, websites, on the one hand, yes, they are great for promoting your stories. They are great for receiving information in real time about all kinds of events. They can be great for creating connections between people. I've met friends through Twitter and had people invite me to come and speak in their communities, and all of that is good. But over the long term, they have a bad impact on our industry. The number one factor is that they are taking away the money. And that's an existential threat to journalism.
I want to go back to what we said in the beginning of this conversation about the readership in this country that constitutes some of your readership, the Palestinian American community and the Jewish American community. The Jewish American community has been pretty powerful politically for a long time, but now we're seeing the Palestinian community gaining some traction in decision-making circles. But still, it's gradually getting there. To what extent do you see those two communities as players in the triangle between Israel, America, and those communities? This cliche about the Palestinian community in Israel, the Arab Israelis, that they are a bridge to peace, right? To what extent do you see a similar dynamic in the communities we're talking about here?
Actually, in this country, I see it as a bridge. It could be, conceivably, because for sure there is a lot of support for the justice of the Palestinian cause among Jewish Americans. I mean, you see it. There are segments of both communities that are hostile and so on. But in fact, I mean, people want to see both people live in peace and have their own state and all these things and so on. So it can conceivably. I don't know about, I'm not an expert with the Israeli Arabs, the Palestinian Israelis. But in this country, yes, it can. And I've seen it happen. And there is, people can be, they see something on television and they get all heated up and so on. But then they meet their neighbor. I mean, in my neighborhood, I think we live in a court and 16 homes and 11 are Jewish Americans. I mean, they're my neighbors and my friends, and we talk and we see the news and all these things. So yes, it can, and people, interact at work, interact on college campuses, and so on. So that can happen. It needs to be planned. The problem is there's lack of planning. The Jewish community, which is large, more powerful, more affluent, better educated than the Palestinian Americans. But also, like you said, I mean, the Palestinians are making baby steps. And they need to break the barriers. I mean, everybody gets upset, when they beat up the blind man the other day. I mean, that, just drives your blood pressure and so on, and you get that feeling of hostility and so on. But, if you talk to someone, I'm not talking, we're professionals, so we don't, but I'm saying, if you take my brothers who are educated and so on, but they watch the news, they watch Al Jazeera, they watch Al Arabiya, they read the newspapers, they get all, but then they talk to their neighbors, and then everything is just, hunky-dory, milk and honey kind of a thing. So it can. I think potentially it can be. We're just beginning to see, an opening in the Jewish community where actually the Palestinians, if you make the proper case, I think if you can make, and the Palestinian issue can speak for itself. I mean, you don't have to have this great rhetoric and so on. I mean, the basics of the conflict are there, so you just need to reach out and do it.
From my point of view, I agree with what Said said, that the Jewish community and the Palestinian community in the United States, they could have positive impact. They could also have negative impacts. Of course, you do have sometimes these phenomena where the people in the diaspora would only encourage a more kind of hardline approach and more suspicion of the other. I've had one Arab diplomat here in DC, I'm not going to say from which country. At one point we had a whole discussion about, situation in the region, and the diplomat said that it's so frustrating to talk about this to the American Jewish community, much easier to talk with you Israelis. I said, what do you mean? The diplomat said, well, you Israelis, maybe we disagree, but at least you understand the facts on the ground. And so that was an interesting kind of conversation.
So do you see your role as well to inform them? I mean, is it so that they could play a positive part in the...
In general, I think journalists need to inform. It's not...
No, but specifically the Jewish Americans.
No, because when I write a story in Haaretz in English, I don't care if my reader is a Jewish American, Palestinian American, or a Palestinian living in Nablus, or an Israeli who prefers to... Israeli born and raised who prefers for some reason to read their news in English. I want to inform the readers, not necessarily this segment or that segment. And that's important because if you would only be laser focused on one demographic, maybe you would even write a different kind of story, but you think about everyone. And in general, I think that people who read Haaretz and other source of information, and if you read Arabic and Quds, you will be more informed. Yes, of course.
I'm Dr. Caroline Poplin. I'm a member of APN and also J Street. And my question is for the gentleman from Haaretz. Do you write about and how aware of Israelis of the split in the American Jewish community now? Are the Israelis interested in that? Are they aware of that? And do you write about that?
So the answer is yes, we do write about it quite a lot. I'll give you an example. The last 2.5 weeks, we had, I don't remember even how many, 4 or 5 stories about the controversy surrounding Netanyahu's political pact with the far-right Otzma Yehudit party, this racist, violent party. And we wrote about the reactions in the American Jewish community, whether it was AIPAC putting out something, a lot of other establishment organizations that are usually supportive of Netanyahu's government, or at least don't criticize it, coming out against. And even I had one story that I'm proud of that story because it was a bit of a harder sell to the editors. story about divisions within the Orthodox community about this issue, that you had some Orthodox organizations and synagogues that came out and said, we support Netanyahu, we understand what he's doing, but then there was a backlash, and you had even within Young Israel, this group of Orthodox synagogues, you had, I think, 20-something synagogues that came out against it. So we do write a lot about it. How much Israelis care? I think they care, but it's not the number one issue on the news agenda, let's be frank about it. There are a lot of other things that are happening. Haaretz gives this more attention than other newspapers in general. I think it's the one newspaper that devotes, I think the two newspapers that I think devote the most attention to this issue are Haaretz and Makor Rishon, which is a right-wing religious weekly. They have a full-time correspondent, a great guy, a friend of mine, Tzvika Klein, who writes about diaspora affairs. He's stationed in Israel, but he writes a lot. And then Haaretz. And it's interesting that these are two more smaller kind of elite newspapers, one of them affiliated with the left, one affiliated with the right, and they pay the most attention to this. It's harder to get this into the more mainstream tabloid newspapers that look for very definitive headlines, and I think the reason is, frankly, because American Jews are too polite. Israeli politics is blunt. You don't, for example, this week with Ilhan Omar, all these Jewish organizations, whether it's, ADL or J Street were hosting here and others, they put out these really thoughtful and long and complicated statements that are very smart and really impressive. And I mean it, okay? I'm not trying to, but at the end of the day, for Haaretz in English, that's great. You'll get 3 paragraphs and you explain. Hebrew readers are like, all right, tachlis, that's the word. Dugri, like, what are they saying here? Is she anti-Semitic or not? Give me the bottom line. And the same with Otzma Yehudit, with the far-right party. Some of these statements that you had put out were like this kind of, very constructed arguments. Israelis want one line, Bibi disappointed us, we don't want to hear about him anymore. That's the kind of thing that will make a headline in Yediot Acharonot, which is more like a tabloid USA Today kind of newspaper. And I think most of the American Jewish community, when they, respond to something, when they speak about it, especially when it has to do with Israel, they think as if the Israelis are like their own audience. And they think about their own audience first and foremost when they put it out. And a lot of times when you get this to the editor, even with AIPAC, by the way, when they denounced, the far-right party, I had to explain to my editors why this is significant, because some of them said, well, yeah, but the denunciation itself is not so crazy. Like if you look at just the language, I said, yeah, but you have to understand this is, in AIPAC language, this is like, a big thing.
They actually quoted the American Jewish Committee.
Yes,
yeah,
yes. You need to give them the context of it.
Said, maybe but it would be interesting to ask you, Said, how the extent to which Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza care about their diaspora here in the United States, and the extent to which they want to learn and use, the extent to which you serve that function, in other words.
Well, in fact, they do. I mean, look, from the West Bank, most Palestinians in America are from the West Bank. You have whole towns like Bechmas, where the big settlement is and so on. The whole town is in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and so on. They're Dubuan. They have everybody in California and Michigan and so on. So yes, I mean, over there they say, you guys, what are you doing? Look at the Jews. Look how they are so influential. What are you doing? They think, they don't understand the issue of numbers and wealth and influence.
Why can't we have AIPAC?
Yeah, there you go. Why can't you have something like AIPAC? And they are always saying, why can't you organize? And you tell them, look at your situation. I mean, you're so divided and so on. So it is, to a lesser extent, Gaza, because it is, so immersed in its own pain and its own suffering and so on. So yes, I mean, they are very interested in what goes on with the Palestinian American community, and a lot of them, people go back and forth. And to their credit, I mean, not my family, not as much, but let's say people from Deir Dubuan and Bechmas, they all have homes there, and they go every summer, and they help people with money and so on. So there's a great deal of interest.
I'm Gabriel Noah Brom. I'm the director of the Center for Academic and Intellectual Freedom at Northern Michigan University. We strive to promote thoughtful discussion of important issues on the college campus, how would you assess the quality of discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, a very important issue, on college campuses today? How could it be improved? Is it helping? Is it hurting? How would you assess the quality of discussion of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute on American campuses today?
Well, there is a lot of discussion. I mean, we've seen over the past year or so a lot of, let's say, regarding BDS, right? A great deal of chapters or colleges, including George Washington, that voted for BDS. Although, the student body is, they are, lopsidedly Jewish. In fact, that were, the student senate and government and so on. And that's what I read. So yes, it's an issue that is being discussed on college campuses. It's different from place to place. There's more heated discussions in Berkeley, or UCLA than, let's say, in some place in the Midwest or something. More so, there's an Arab studies at Georgetown, that's very vibrant and very active and invites people and so on. So yes, so the issue, discussion of the issue on campuses generates interest, and it creates conflict, and especially now with the BDS being such a polarizing issue, with the states taking steps and so on to delegitimize it or to make it illegal, whatever, or to put anyone who supports BDS, under their own boycott and so on. But college campuses have always been, as important as they are, almost disconnected from the mainstream of the population.
My impression is that it really depends which. I don't like to make a grand characterization about colleges or universities. I've been invited to speak in places where I was so impressed by the questions of the students and their comments and their interaction with them, and I learned, really. I came sometimes to speak about Israel and the Palestinian issue and the conflict, and I actually learned from the interaction with students or professors. And other places where I was disappointed and I felt it was shallow and very political and political in the shallow way, but good or bad, black or white situations. And I think that you have a lot of smart and impressive professors who do important work on this issue. Paul Sham, who's here, with us, for example. And, people really do good research and good teaching on this. And other places where not so much. And I think, in education, at the end of the day, my mom was a teacher and a high school principal, so she always used to tell me, the only thing that matters is, do you like the teacher? That's in a class, in a course, and I think it's also true for this question.
Meir, I'd like to ask you about how you are received by the right wing in this country. Haaretz is known to anyone who's familiar with the Israel as a left wing. You were even denounced by your former correspondent in the New York Times a couple of years ago. When I talk to right-wingers, which isn't that often, they sneer if I quote Haaretz. How do you experience this with American Jews or others who know Haaretz's point of view?
And I'll just say, since he didn't plug his affiliation, the question was asked by Paul Sham of Partners for Progressive Israel and University of Maryland.
So
separately, yes.
I would make a distinction here between Jewish right-wingers and non-Jewish right-wingers. Haaretz, this is something I've learned since coming here, has a lot of fans in the evangelical community in the United States. People who care about Israel, deeply devoted to it. Many times they are right-wingers, they support Netanyahu, they support Trump, but they read Haaretz, they know we are a liberal newspaper, they know, some of them will tell me, oh, you are like the New York Times of Israel. I don't know if it's a compliment or an insult, but they read it and they appreciate it. And one of the issues I've kind of adopted since coming here is to write more about evangelicals. I think they have a growing influence on American policy in the Middle East. They have a growing influence on Israel. And I've had a lot of stories about evangelicals in the Middle East, and the reception has been great, and I've developed good sources over there, and I feel that it's a very respectful relationship. In the Jewish community, actually on the right wing, I feel there is more hostility to Haaretz. And I think it has to do with the fact that a lot of evangelicals, of course not all, but I'm giving kind of a broad characterization, they will say, if this person who is Israeli, who lives there and has family there and served in the military, blah, 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 if they choose to be left-wing, maybe God will help them, but it's their choice and I respect it. They are Israelis. I think within the American Jewish community, you do have some people on the right wing who will be much more hostile to that. And, you will say, self-hating Jews. Although not all of them. I do have a professional and good relationship with people from organizations like the Republican Jewish Coalition, some other groups on the right wing, the Orthodox Union. And with those people, it's a professional relationship. And they can complain about my story just as much as APN or J Street or APAC or ADL can complain about a story. It's professional. So I do find it interesting that for me, I've never had a negative comment about Haaretz from someone who is deep in the business, of Israel and the Middle East from the evangelical side, for example, but there is some hostility sometimes from the Jewish right wing. That's true.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the question you asked, Ori, that sort of semi-preempted mine of Saeed. I'm Howard Sumka. I used to be the director of the USAID mission for West Bank and Gaza. You don't have anything like the robustness of the American Jewish community that Amir can feed on so nicely and generate all these stories about AIPAC and J Street and so on. But I know there's a wide range of different opinions in the Palestinian American community, and particularly in the DC area. I know during the Bush and Obama administrations, there were different views about what the relationship of the Palestinian community should be to the State Department, to the US government, to the administration. And there was a fair bit of conflict. And I wonder if you reported on that much, and if the people back home were interested in that kind of dynamic in the politics of the Palestinian American community, and how that message got across.
It's always good to see you, Howard. I mean, Howard and Paul and I, we go to the same places and so on. It is actually a very good question. I think that the American administrations or American official institutions and so on, they really disregard the Palestinian American community. They have no connection with them. They know that they are powerless. They cannot influence the situation. Maybe now the Kushner, because they're desperate to talk to Palestinians, they are trying to reach out to some people. But other than that, they always talk to, let's say, the PLO or to Arab governments. They want to reach the Palestinians, but not the Palestinian community. Now, there are diverse opinions, and they are huge. And you saw, the Palestinians until the middle or, even late 80s, they were basically advocating secular movement. They were supporters of Fatah and the Popular Front and lefties and so on. That's the bulk. But then you had the rise of Islamism and the collapse of Arab nationalism, and that was reflected on the community. So they became religious for a while. It says we do have, of course, Christian Palestinians, but it's a smaller community. So they began to support Hamas or began to support the Muslim Brotherhood. They're friends, but nobody reached out to them. They were brought into the White House, during Ramadan or the iftar or something like this. They would bring in, some Palestinian leaders, but not as a community. The community until today is completely dismissed, not only by the government or groups, organized groups, or even by the Jewish community, but by everybody. They are marginal. If there's an event, yes, there would be some focus put on that event. If there's a conference there are no major Palestinian American organizations today. There used to be, and it was, they would have conferences and it would be well attended. But now they would be part of the ADC convention or part of this convention or part of that convention and so on. But the Islamists, yes, they are strong because they are more disciplined. They are they do well, they have money, they are willing to put their money where their mouth is, and they are beginning just to gain traction. However, the flip side of that, the whole Islamist ideology is really falling apart. It's being discredited over there and over here. Thank you. Sorry.
Thanks. It's a quick question, and that's just one. Let's say two possible headlines for the morning of April 10th after the Israeli elections.
Saeed is like, you deal with that.
You
trouble.
deal with that, exactly. Yeah.
I think there are two possible headlines. One is that Netanyahu has another term. And now the big question is, what coalition is he going to have? Is it going to be the same pure right-wing religious coalition that he had last time? And if that happens, I will have a lot of work because that's going to create a lot of tensions with the Jewish community. I think it's also going to increase the tensions with the Democratic Party in the United States, and it could also be the death of the Trump peace plan. Netanyahu goes to the pure right-wing coalition, I'll be busy. And then there is the option that he goes to a centrist kind of center-right coalition with Gantz's party. I know they said they will not sit together, and I believe it like as much as I can fly from the roof of this building. I'm not going to try. The other option is that Gantz wins the election. Netanyahu doesn't have the ability to form a coalition, and then Gantz will try to, I think, do a coalition with Likud actually, and with Labor. He will try to kind of build like a national unity government. With, his whole campaign is there is no more left and right. There is no more left wing, right wing. We're all about Israel. We're all together. And he said, I will call Likud and then call Labor. And I think that's his only way to do a coalition if he wins. So that's actually believable. And a government like that, I think, will be, in my opinion, will do a lot of good things for Israel internally. I don't think it will change anything on the Palestinian issue. I think a government like that will have a mandate to protect the Supreme Court from the Israeli right-wing plans to basically turn it into a joke. It will have the ability to protect and expand civil rights in Israel, including civil marriages, because it will not have religious parties. More religious pluralism, acceptance of reform and conservative Judaism. It will probably try to fix the nation-state law, to add a clause into it about equality and about respecting minorities in the society. It could have different economic priorities, maybe less money to the ultra-Orthodox parties and to other sectors and more to healthcare and stuff like that. I don't think it will have a mandate to end the occupation and dismantle settlements. This is something that, if Gantz is prime minister, his government will not do that. This will, if some government will do it, maybe the next one. And, actually, my personal opinion, a bigger chance for a change on the Palestinian issue if Netanyahu is prime minister. A bigger chance. If he's prime minister and he goes into a center-right coalition. Because if Netanyahu goes into center-right coalition, which is not obvious, he could also prefer to just go with the right wing. But if he does that, this is probably his last term. He's trying to fight off his legal challenges. He has maybe a year in office before the indictment kicks him out. Trump comes with this peace plan. Maybe Netanyahu just says, all right, this is my last, let's go out with a bang and does something big. Maybe. Whereas Gantz, if he now becomes prime minister, he says, Netanyahu is waiting or whoever, will replace Netanyahu in the right wing is waiting for me in the shadows. The last thing I want to do is lose power because of this Palestinian issue that many Israelis don't care about because they don't believe there is a partner for peace, blah, blah, blah. So he focuses on internal issues, he focuses on everything else I said, and tries not to do anything controversial with the Palestinians. So that's my take on the elections in 2 sentences.
Okay, so in 2 sentences, just because we're trying to maintain a little bit of balance, I wanted to ask Saeed, since we're, engaging in futurism, what do you see? How do you see the future of Palestinian leadership?
Well, that's a very difficult question.
Good luck, Saeed.
In 2 sentences.
Well, in 2 sentences, I think that Abbas will name a successor at one point, and we will see the same kind of inept leadership go on for the foreseeable 4 or 5 years.
You think the successor may have the same family name as yours?
No, I don't think so, because he's first of all, he has a lot of competition, but also I don't think his health, he has health issues. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. So, Ed Abrams, you get the last one. to the
Fascinated
microphone.
by your last comment about what Netanyahu might do. And so my question is, why do you think he would do that?
Oh, I'm not saying.
What gives you any reason to believe that he would move in that direction if he won the election?
Listen, again, if he wins the election and he sets up a pure right-wing coalition, then not only he's not going to do any... Would I put it at more than 50%? No. I'm just saying with Gantz, it's probably 5%. With Bibi, maybe 10, okay? I'm not trying to say, it's like very likely. What politicians think is doesn't matter. What matters is how they want to keep power. Netanyahu's idea of keeping power so far has been to align himself with the right wing. When Obama was elected and then re-elected, there were periods of a year to a year and a half where he tried to be more flexible on the Palestinian issue, negotiations, compromises, settlement freeze, that kind of stuff. So, if he decides that he's not going to stay in power anyway because he's going to be indicted and he's going to have... Netanyahu really wants to pass a law that would make it illegal to indict him. Gantz would never support that kind of law. So if Netanyahu is forced into a centrist coalition, that's game over. He is not going to be able to pass this kind of anti-democratic legislation, and it means he has a year left in power at top before he's indicted, and that's it. So what he does in that year, anything is possible. I don't know. My calculation on Gantz is that if he becomes prime minister, he can stay there now for 4 or 8 years. Why take any risks? So it doesn't mean that I think Netanyahu is on the verge of making peace. Let's not exaggerate.
Gilad and I met this morning, again, for the first time, as I said, over breakfast. We had a kind of a podcaster's conversation, and I asked him what's his editing philosophy. And he said, I don't edit. We're very focused when we do the interview, whereas I said I actually edit pretty heavily. I think that this evening would not require any kind of editing. This was a really fascinating conversation. I wanted to thank everyone who came here, and particularly to thank Said Arikat and Amir Tibon for joining us for this truly fascinating conversation. And again, to you, Gilad, thank you very much for initiating this and for the partnership.
Thank you, Ori.